Nigeria television theme. Today we have a very, very interesting discussion before us. We're going to be discussing classical education, and we have our friend and our brother Gbanaibolou Burutolu. He's going to help me to pronounce his name better later when he introduces himself. But we're going to have Gbanaibolou Burutolu come to discuss with us. He's actually already in the studios. And so we want to thank you. GB, I usually call him GB. So let me use the opportunity to welcome you. GB, thank you very much for heeding our invitation. Thank you so much for coming. Okay, so right now I'll just do a little profile introduction of our guests. I call him GB because it's much easier for me to pronounce the reverse name than this. He will tell us how the name is pronounced. But GB is a Christian who enjoys studying and discussing the systems of doctrines as they are taught in the Bible. GB is a man of many interests spanning across theology, classical education, data science, visual programming, and entrepreneurship. At his spare time, he reads classical books and research the latest trends in the tech industry. He currently works as a works engineer at the Nigerian Maritime University. I believe that is in Delta State, where he ensures the smooth running of university infrastructures. GB is single and aspires to be a federal husband soon to a godly, complementarian woman and to build a home for the glory of God. Okay, so that is the formal introduction of GB. But on a personal note, I met GB in 2017 and in a conference in Lagos, and thanks to the internet, we have kept in touch throughout the years. Okay, I'm not sure whether I've seen him since that year or since that year that I saw him, along with Pastor Conrad Mbowe from Zambia. So GB is going to be talking to us about classical education, and I am like, no, I know nothing about classical education. So actually, I'm here in class to learn. But at the same time, I have also gotten familiar with the whole concept through my own association with Reformed Theology. GB's pronouncement, he talks about it on social media. And there was a time that they had this conference, I think online also, to discuss it. So at the moment, I'm just going to hand over to Gbanaibolou. So GB, please, can you help us? Perhaps I should, let's have a video. Perhaps I should ask some background questions. First of all, how do we pronounce your name?
Okay, well, Gbanaibolou Burutolu is my name. It's not that hard.
Okay, Gbanaibolou Burutolu. So anyway, yes. For short, it is GB. Okay. Can you also tell us something a little bit, since we're going to be talking about classical education? Ask you before we can went live. Do you have like a presentation, like a PDF? No. What do we call this thing?
PowerPoint slides.
PowerPoint presentation. Yes. Do you have anything like that?
Oh, no, I do not.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay if you don't have. I just thought maybe you wanted to do a formal presentation. But yeah, anyway,
I would have loved to do that. Maybe, yeah.
Okay, can you tell us something about your educational background and so on?
Oh, okay. So I hold Bachelor of Engineering from University of East London. That's for my first degree. I don't have a second degree yet, thanks to ASU. Yeah, then for my primary secondary school, I did school in Bayelsa State.
Okay, all right. Okay, so let me ask another thing. Is there a connection between this classical education? I'm sure you're still going to shed light on that, but I just want to know, is there a connection between the classical education and the Christian faith? in general? Is there some kind of connection with that?
Oh, sure. You're going to hear it. That's why the title is The Christian Imperative for Classical Education.
Okay, excellent. So because of that, I would have loved to hear your testimony, but we're just going to, at this moment, switch over to you. So at the moment, I'm just going to shut down my video and hand over the reins of the broadcast to you.
All right. Thank you, Deji, for having me here. Thanks to all you do with regards to the reform movement in Nigeria and trying to advance the work of Christ in this part of the world. So, excuse me. So you already know that I do. Okay, I shouldn't be talking to Deji. I should be talking to everybody. But he knows that I have a lot of interest and passion for classical education. I talk about it almost all the time online, on Facebook, and then I'm also involved in some activities in classical Christian works around the country, in Jos, in Lagos as well, and also in a new group we just founded called Paideia Leadership University, where we are promoting classical ideas and classical education. So I'm here to talk about classical education and then also the biblical imperative for it. I'm going to start with a quote by G.K. Chesterton. He was a British writer, and I think a lot of people know him. Readers know him a lot to be a very good writer and thinker and philosopher as well. So the quote goes this way.
Sorry, Jimmy. Sorry, I'm very sorry. Is the quote is on your system, right?
Yes, it is on my system.
And would you like to get the viewers to see it? Is it something you want for the viewers? Because I can actually make you a co-host and then you can share your screen. Is it possible?
Let me see.
So that when you want them to see your screen, we'll allow it. If not, we just shut it down.
Well, it's really tiny. I should
have.
Put it in
a. All right. No problem.
Put it in a slide.
No problem. Let me just allow you to continue your discussion with the code.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. So I'm going to start with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another. Whatever the soul is like, it will have to be passed on somehow, consciously or unconsciously. And that transition may be called education. Again, let me read. This time a little bit faster. Education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another. Whatever the soul is like, it will have to be passed on somehow, consciously or unconsciously. And that transition may be called education, full stop. So the question to us would be, what part of the soul of our society are we passing on to our children? And because Deji said I have a very short time, I'm going to crash everything into a very quick talk, because the word of classical education.
We can allow an hour presentation, because we're not too many here, so there might not be too many questions, but we can allow an hour presentation.
All right, cool then. But even in an hour is not enough to exhaust what classical education is or the full scope of it. But I'll just give an interesting imperative that I guess I believe should urge everybody to make further research into what classical education is, especially from a biblical perspective. All right, so I'll be reading from Ephesians 6, verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Again, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The word discipline in this text or in that text is the Greek word called paideia. Paideia. It's spelled P-A-I-D-E-I-A. P-A-I-P-D-E-I-A. Paideia. The word paideia means so much more than discipline. So let's look into the word called paideia. Telly's Greek lexicon defines paideia as the whole training and education of children. Again, the whole training and education of children. He went further to say, which relates to the cultivation of mind and morals, and employs for this purpose commands and admonitions, reproof, and punishment. Then the dictionary gave another definition again and said, whatever in adults also cultivates the soul, especially by correcting the mistakes and curbing the passions. Hence, in 2 Timothy 3 verse 16, there's an instruction there that says that education or discipline increases virtue. And the biblical usage usually is chastisement. Now, these are the ideas of Thales in his Greek lexicon. So for me, the most important definition is the first definition, actually, the primary definition, which is the whole training and education of children. This is what we are commanded to do. I don't know if we are doing it in Nigeria, if parents are actually heeding to this instruction, this idea of paideia, right? Training up your children in the paideia of the Lord. I'm not sure if parents in Nigeria are truly heeding onto that. Well, of course, parents across the world, some parents are now awakening to this idea and trying to train their children. So thank God for that there's an awakening in that regard. So the question that usually follows this idea is, can we really train or raise our children in the paideia of Christ when we send them to public schools? Can we? If the training of children, the education of children is in the Greek term paideia, which means the building of the morals and mind of children after the instruction of Christ, can we raise our children in the paideia of Christ when we send them to public schools? I would like to quote an author called William Bryan. He said, parents have a right to say that no teacher paid by their money shall rob their children of faith in God and send them back to their homes skeptics or infidels or agnostics or atheists or immoral or Hebrew. Excuse me. Again, parents have a right to say that no teacher paid by their money shall rob their children of faith in God and send them back to their schools, skeptics or infidels or agnostics or atheists or immoral or ill-bred. First, this is a question each Christian parent must answer for themselves. Every child is different. That said, here are some major barriers that must be overcome in order for the Christian paideia to take roots in children in public schools. Explicit indoctrination. Number one, explicit indoctrination. Number two, implicit indoctrination. Number three, the teacher as the pedagogas, and number 4, 12 hours of learning in school. I'll just say a brief comment on each of them. So, number 1, explicit indoctrination. So I know this exists a lot in the West, but it's also coming up in our own society as well, where teachers in school, secondary school, university, even primary and nursery school, they are now openly teaching teaching children things that are totally ungodly. In an explicit way, there is the introduction of, let's say, the popular heinous teachings on LGBTQ and all these gender-related issues, abortion. These were issues that were not discussed in the classroom before, right? Things like evolution, they were not majorly brought in an explicit way in the classroom. But right now, that is what is happening in classrooms right now. As a teacher is going, they always make a recourse to all of these things in an explicit way. Then again, they also do it in a subjective or implicit way as well. And the implicit indoctrination is below the surface. It's usually hidden, and therefore it is more dangerous. So you don't even know that this is going on. It's hidden in the text, it's hidden in their teaching, and the children, because they are naive, cannot even detect what is going on as well. Let me quote again from somebody. His name is C.S. Lewis, and this quote is from his book, The Abolition of Man. This is what he said, quote, "In their second chapter, Gaius and Titus quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the waterfall. You remember that there were 2 tourists present. That one called it sublime and the other pretty. And that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titus comment as follows. When the man said, 'This is sublime,' he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime. Or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion. But the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we are only saying something about our own feelings." End of quote. Well, it may sound complicated, but what C.S. Lewis is actually saying, he's talking about the dangers of our modern day education, our modern system of education. So Lewis goes on and tells this story, and it comes from a poem, Coleridge. Coleridge also is another classical author. It comes from a poem Coleridge wrote. And in the poem, Coleridge is talking about a waterfall. There are 2 people in that poem talking about a waterfall. One person calls it sublime, and then the other person calls it, oh, well, it's a pretty waterfall. So Coleridge believes the waterfall is sublime. He endorses that view. And the question is, what's the difference between sublime and pretty? Something that is sublime is something that is transcendental. is reflective of God's beauty. And that's what Coleridge believed, that the person who said the waterfall was sublime, that person was accurate. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but clue in here on what had just happened. So because this is happening in the idea of objective value, right? The idea of objective value is being assaulted. We as Christians know that if waterfall is sublime, it's part of God's creation. So if you look at Romans 1, God's creation bears a testimony to God's truth and power on earth. So as Christians, we look at the waterfall and says, this is sublime. It's beautiful because it reflects the beauty of God. But in our modern education system, it is not sublime. You just feel sublime. It's a subjective reality. And again, it might not seem like a big deal, but what has happened is the denial of objective truth and value. It sneaks in relativism. Relativism says that we don't have objective truth. One thing might be true to you, I have a different truth. This kind of thinking permeates all through our modern curricula. Again, this is what C.S. Lewis said. I'm quoting from him again. Quote, until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. That is, believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. The reason why Coleridge agreed with the tourist who called the cataract sublime and disagreed with the one who called it pretty was, of course, that he believed inanimate objects to be such that certain responses could be more just or ordinate and appropriate to it than others. St. Augustine defines virtue or ordo amoris. The Latin word for virtue is called ordo amoris. The ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. In the Republic, the well-matured youth is one, in quotes, who would see most clearly whatever was amiss in ill-made works of man or heel-grown works of nature, and with a just delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. End of quote. So what Lewis is actually saying here is this, that in this earth, there are some things we should love, and there are some things that we should hate. And we should recognize that true education is something that teaches young people to love God and to love the things of God, to love God's truth, beauty, and goodness, and teaches young people to despise the way that Satan has distorted and has corrupted and tries to bend the truth, beauty, and goodness. If students don't believe that there is objective truth, beauty, and goodness, there is going to come a time where they would say, look, all religions are the same. Their faith is in question, and they don't have anything to defend it with. I know again that this reality is more available in the West, but trust me, this is so much gaining roots in our own context at the moment. I've met a lot of children in primary, secondary, and especially at university level who are fighting against and questioning objective truth, and then even denying it. And they are even questioning the existence of God. And most of these kids, to the shock of a lot of people, did have a religious background. They came from Christian homes where parents and mothers were trying to imbibe Christian virtues in them. But the children were sent to public schools, and they began to be taught and educated in the public school system, where they questioned these things and met friends. And before you know, they began to doubt their faith and then also lose their Christian roots. So again, this reality is gaining so much context, is gaining so much ground and roots, even in our own context in Africa and Nigeria today as well. I would like to quote from C.S. Lewis again. He said, "We make men without chest and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the Gildings be fruitful." End of quote. Let me read this quote again. "We make men without chest and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the Gildings be fruitful." Our modern education makes men without chest. We rip out our heart and soul. Anyway, let me go straight to the third point. Teachers as the pedagogues. The third reason why parents, especially Christian parents, should consider the kind of school they send their children to is because classically, teachers are seen as the pedagogues. Let me define what that means. Again, I'll take the definition of one of the great Greek philosophers. His name is Herodotus. He said, a pedagogus is a tutor, and the kind of tutor is defined by two words, a guide and a guardian of boys, a guide and a guardian of boys. Among the Greeks and Romans, the name was applied to trustworthy slaves who were charged with the duty of supervising the life and morals of boys belonging to the better class. Then from our own Christian standpoint, we also should see, or the Bible actually sees, Christian teachers as pedagogues as well. In Philippians, in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1, Paul said, "Be imitators of me as I imitate Christ." So classically, the teacher models what the student ought to be in terms of virtue, morals, and knowledge. The teachers have an immense and extraordinary influence and power over the lives of children. They get to speak to them over an hour every day. I think the average kids in Nigeria spend up to 5 hours in school every single day. Then when you put down, when you calculate how much they spend, the amount of hours they spend from primary 1 to SS3, you put that together and you have like 12,000 plus of hours in the classroom. And then you contrast that to how much how much time they spend in church on a Sunday per week. You find that to be just 2 to 3 hours per week. The children spend just 1 to 2 hours in Sunday school in church, you know? So the question they usually ask is, can nearly 2 to 3 hours in church per week counter the amount of hours they spend out there in the world and in a non-Christ-like, in a non-godly educational system. There is a quote from the Classical Difference I would like to quote. They said, in quote, "When we see younger generations embracing things that are not true or condemning things that they should accept, we are watching paideia at work." About 100 years ago, progressives realized the power of paideia. They realized that to change our world toward a progressive model, they must first change the paideia of the young. Historically, the only successful way of doing this was through education. That's what John Dewey, in quote, in open bracket, the father of modern education, close bracket, and other progressives set out to do at the turn of the 20th century. And they succeeded. Now, less than 3 generations later, Christians have inadvertently absorbed the progressives' idea. Talk to generation X and even millennials, you would see it if you know what to look for. If you are under 90, you've almost certainly been shaped by the progressive idea, but you just can't see your own idea very easily. End of quote. So what they are saying is that there's a revolution that took place early last century. Before early last century, that was before the 20th century, the mainstream system of education wasn't what we have today. It was a classical system of education where you are molded or you are instructed in the good, the true, and the beautiful. But towards the beginning of last century, something happened. An ungodly man called John Dewey, he's called, if you've read the history of education and the history of the modern system of education we run today, you will surely see the name of this man. So this man, an ungodly man, sought to unturn that system of education that most of the world back then, right, up until early last century had been educated in, where again they appreciated the good, the true, and the beautiful, and in that way saw the goodness of God in the creation of the world, in things that are created. Because he was ungodly and atheistic, he had to design it in a way that was in revolt to this classical education that we are talking about, and then now invented what they call progressive education. So it's very, very likely that 99% of the audience that would listen to this podcast or that would listen to this live presentation or whatsoever actually went through this progressive education without them knowing. And the goal of this progressive education system is not to awaken our affections to the true, the good, and beautiful. It is not to help children or to help human beings achieve the highest form of education in pursuing objective truth. No, it is completely subjective and also utilitarian. The goal of education right now is to get a skill in order for you to get a job out there, maybe in the factory or in an office or somewhere, or in our modern work climate right now or work economy, a remote job. Again, this progressive education did not seek to, or is not seeking to awaken our affections to the good, the true, and the beautiful, but it is entirely utilitarian get a skill, and go out there and earn money, and that's the goal of that kind of education. But prior to the early 18th century, the goal of education wasn't job. Of course, you get equipped in skills as well, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to be awakened to higher things, to objective truth, to the good, the true, and the beauty. So when you look at a waterfall, what you see there, you see the objective sublimity of a waterfall, and not the subjective experience of, well, it's just pretty. Anyway, so a question usually that parents ask, or even some people ask, is, wait, don't we already have a lot of private Christian schools out there? Like, you're talking about Christian education, and you're trying to raise the dangers of sending children to a school that does not run a Christian model, or a model that is faithful to the idea of Christ. Yeah, there are a lot of Christian schools out there. So what about them? Well, truth be said, most of the private Christian schools out there use the modern model of education, and not the classical model. Again, yes, it's true that a lot of Christian schools out there, or there are a lot of Christian schools out there right now, and even more are popping up day by day. But the problem is that they still use the modern model of education, the progressive model of education, and not the classical model. So I'm going to do a rundown of the timeline of this model, this classical model we are talking about, that is Christian. And it began before Christ. It began with people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and all these guys did advocate education as a pursuit of truth, beauty, goodness, and justice. If you read their works, you would find all the subjects there. Socrates especially teaches his students to pursue the good through questioning. Then you move to the second century, the second, third, fourth, and fifth century. What do you meet? You meet with the church fathers, men like Origen, Clement, Augustine. All of these early church fathers advocated that method of Christian education that incorporated the classical liberal arts. Then you also find that Paul also did advocate that model. For instance, now if you remember his words, where he did preach the gospel at Areopagus. He was instructing the Ephesians to raise their children in the idea of Christ. Then perhaps you come down to the 18th century, where you have almost all, or nearly all, the US founding fathers to have received a classical Christian education. Again, almost all the founding fathers of America received a classical Christian education. I'm not sure if you've listened to them before. You could go online, perhaps type their names and read their works, and even watch a movie about them. I've watched a movie about them. John Adams and all of them. If you see the texture of their mind, the way they use words, the rich vocab they have, right? The soundness of their mind, and their ability to conceive things and frame America as it is today was really profound. That education could only have been classical Christian. And then also perhaps if you read church history and you know about the reformers and you know about the Puritans as well, when I got to meet them many years ago, like 12, 13 years ago, when I read their works and saw how rich they were, excellent they were, I was wondering what kind of education they had, what kind of education molded their minds to be the way it is. If you read the works of John Calvin, you'll just be blown away at the profundity of his thought, and read the words of the boldness of Martin Luther. And these guys were all educated in this same system of the classical liberal arts that has a foundation in Christian truth. So again, for virtually 2,500 years of human history, the liberal arts education or classical education was like the norm of education in the world until last century, when John Dewey came and successfully replaced that education with a more modern and progressive system that now produces people who cannot even think critically and cannot even reason on their own, or cannot speak well, appropriately, do not know logic or grammar or any of these liberal arts that built Western civilization. So what's the difference? Why classical Christian education? There are 4 points I would like to talk about. Number one, the aim of classical education is to help students, shape students into virtuous, moral people who love truth, goodness, and beauty. Whereas the goal of modern education is to produce workers and to indoctrinate citizens. That's just the pure truth. Number two, classical education strives to teach students how to think critically, articulate eloquently, and rigorously pursue the truth. Whereas modern education seeks to train students to memorize vast sets of information. Again, we all went through this modern system from primary, secondary, university, where we were trained to memorize things, a large set of information that we pour out on examination day in order to proceed to the next class. That's what modern education is. But classical education is different. You are trained in critical thinking, rhetorics, so you could articulate eloquently and write beautifully. And you are also trained to rigorously pursue the truth. Number three, the classical classroom has much of dialectic, that is lecture-based instruction, than a modern classroom. In a modern classroom, instead, students refine their reading, speaking, and critical thinking skills in a Socratic seminar. Well, this is actually in the classical method. So in the classical method, there is a back and forth conversational atmosphere in the classroom, where the teacher throws up a question that is meant to provoke the students to begin to think. So again, the goal is to provoke the kids to develop their brain power, their critical thinking. The fourth and the last, classical education involves close study and discussion of the great books through the great books. Classical education involves close study and discussion of the great books. Through the great books, classical students interact with the greatest minds of humanity. Students are taught to compare what these authors say with the truth found in scripture, whereas modern students have little need for the great books or for this sort of learning. So this is again reflective of what is going on in our education system today. I never, throughout my education training in Nigeria, secondary to, even abroad, secondary to university, I never read any literature from older centuries, let's say from the 4th century before Christ, or 1st or 2nd, 3rd, 5th century after Christ. We never, because we thought they were irrelevant, right? I don't think I even knew them. And that's the case for so many people. But in the classical model, all those great works, all those great books are brought into class, and the students are guided to read and interact with them. And by reading and interacting with them, you are interacting with the greatest authors humanity has ever produced. Why greatest? Again, well, this is, the world came together. The Encyclopedia Britannica came together and said, oh, let's embark on a project to create all the best books that have been the most influential on human history so far. So they began the project, and yeah, so they now compiled all these books together and then named it the great books of the Western world. It's a canon of books with various authors. And indeed, those books, if you read them, I think you would also confess that these books are the greatest books humanity has ever produced, from Homer down to Plato, down to Virgil, down to Augustine, down to Adam Smith, down to all the revolutionaries that have contributed immensely to the building of Western society. And they cover various aspects of human knowledge and learning, from history to literature, to philosophy, to poetry, to theology, to religion, to science, to art, to name all the great categories of modern learning today. So the beauty is that all of these things sharpen the brain and minds of children in such a way that modern education cannot even offer, because you just read some modern shallow texts and you're not trained properly in and your mind is not trained properly in the good, the true, and the beautiful. To put them again side by side, that is the difference between this classical Christian model and the modern progressive model. I would put them side by side for your learning. Sorry, I couldn't produce the slide. Just listen as I read. So in terms of demographic, every student should attain the same level of achievement. Then in terms of excellence, take each student to the highest possible potential. So in the classical model, every single student should attain the same level of achievement. That's not what you have in our modern progressive education so far, right? Where you have first class, second class, upper, and people are just distinguished into different categories. But the classical model ensures that everybody, right, is awakened to that level of achievement whereby it's almost, everybody is almost achieving the same grades in class. So there is no disparity in terms of achievement. And the secret is that every of the students is functioning at their highest possible potential. That is what the classical model achieves. In terms of culture, in terms of culture, the classical model tends to shape culture and society in a way that is conservative. By conservative, I mean you are still pursuing and promoting virtue in society. Whereas the modern model seeks to push back on those virtues, those great virtues that built modern society. In terms of nature, the classical Christian model emphasizes that maths, science, arts, literature, and history should be learned by the student. Again, math, science, history, art, all these things should be learned by the student. But the modern model, the progressive model, separates the students between arts and science. Right from primary school level or even secondary school level, well, at best, secondary school level. So you find a category of students who are in arts, and then you also find the other categories of students who are in humanities, then sciences as well. So I'm a science student, I'm an arts student. No, the classical Christian method is more universal. They emphasize the humanities, emphasize the arts, emphasize sciences, because all of these things bring a full perspective to your worldview, to your education. You're fully formed as a human being, and then you are operating at your highest possible potential. The next is, in terms of being secular, the modern education is more secular, right? And says that spirituality is subjective, and they separate that from education. So you go through our modern day education, and your education is not annexed to God or the spiritual. It is completely left outside the classroom. But the classical Christian method that we are talking about underpins education itself to religion or to God, having God as the foundation of knowledge and wisdom. Whereas the modern progressive method that we have today says that, well, we want to be neutral in terms of everything. We want to be neutral in religion. We want to be neutral even in the values that we hold. So they pride themselves to be values neutral. Whereas the classical Christian method is saying, no, we need to teach values. We are pro values. There are standards of right and wrong, and they exist in all subject areas. Then again, the modern progressive method is broken into pieces of knowledge, and it can be more carefully studied and thus understood. That's what they said. But in this classical method, the subjects are integrated, and they are to be taught in an integrated way so that students understand the whole as well as the parts. The progressive method, again, teaches facts and functional skills, right? So students primarily learn about subjects, particularly ones that help them get good jobs. I've mentioned this before. But the classical method teaches critical thinking. Students learn to think beyond subject matter, and content is not the goal, but wisdom is the goal. And then the progressive method is always experimenting with new techniques and methods, whereas the classical method holds on to tradition, holds on to historical standards for learning and for education, and they set very clear record of success. And lastly, this progressive method entertains students to engage them in learning process. Well, you see a lot of toys and classes, and everything just seems entertaining also. Whereas this classical method is more engaging. You are engaged and you are challenged. Students will meet a high standard and enjoy that sense of achievement. So when you compare the both methods together in terms of learning style, in terms of values, in terms of worldview, in terms of techniques, in terms of spirituality, in terms of culture, in terms of excellence, you see that the classical method is more in tune and in line with Christian values and Christian education than the modern progressive method of education that we have today. So again, I would end with that Bible verse I started with. Ephesians 6, verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline, that is, in the idea and instruction of the Lord. And that's what Paul is saying. I didn't have time to quote all through the scriptures, otherwise I would have gone to Proverbs as well, and so many other texts that support this imperative that children are to be brought up according to the wisdom of Christ, according to the idea of Christ, according to the wisdom of God, and not of this world. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, GB, for that wonderful presentation. I just pray that my internet doesn't fail. It's telling me my internet is unstable here. Let me say that I didn't have an idea of what you were going to present. I know that you had talked about this in a conference before. I couldn't attend that conference, but I was able to key into some of the things you were saying, because my training at my seminary actually had a classical bent to it, you know, and
nice.
I knew the richness, I knew what I got out of it, you know. At the seminary, you know, even before I went to seminary, like most Christians, we have to sit down with scriptures and learn the truth of God's word from the scriptures. And we all know, well, I believe most of us know how we encountered great truths like justification by faith, the security of God's people in Christ Jesus, law and grace, all of those truths that you come across, how those truths just, they enter into you and they kind of change your mindset, they change your worldview, they change, in fact, they change your person entirely. That was how my training at the seminary was, you know. It was a whole ton around, and I always said that it was the best education that I had. But now that you have said this, or now that I've listened to what you presented, it is very clear to me what this classical education is, as against the progressive education that we have. You know, I've been in the work space or environment for a long time, and sometimes when you encounter fresh graduates, they come into the system like they are blank, like they didn't learn anything. Okay, they have good command of English, they have this, but they can't hold an argument. The critical thinking is absent. You know, they always only tend to learn, or they are only able to do what you teach them. Okay, so you begin to have to, okay, you employ somebody to probably into an engineering system now, you teach the person how to fix a machine, and that is all that he knows, how to fix the machine. You know, but from what you are saying, apparently one might be able to go beyond just even fixing the machine. You might even be able to write a textbook around the building of the machine, probably the founding of the machine, the people who brought forth the idea of why we have this, we needed this kind of machine. You know, you might even be able to, so limiting education to just sciences sometimes in this our senior secondary school apparently is defrauding the children. You know, I have my children are growing up, they are 10 and 8, and sometimes when I look at them, I look at their minds, I realize they have great capacity for learning, great capacity. I went to a brother's home in Lagos, and I sat before the 7-year-old child, and she was able to reel out the whole of Psalm 119 from the first verse to 176. You know, she was almost sleeping, but she was just reeling it out. She was just reeling it out because the parent had taught her to learn those scriptures. But I think what I just learned from that was that children's mind have a great capacity for learning. You know, so if they are in school, teach them as much as they can grasp. And then in adult life, they now be able to probably specialize. But even in specializing either in the sciences, in the arts, in humanities, whatever they are specializing in, they will still be able to function in other areas, you know, as maybe like byproducts and all of that. So I think I am getting what you are saying about this classical education. And I came in to probably pause you because I have the feeling that you will have to come back and give us a part 2 to this discussion, because I mean, you just seem to have just touched it, you know. I mean, it's just beautiful. It's just beautiful, and it's unfortunate we don't have more people, but it's going to be available online for those who will learn from it. So, our question to you: can you do a part 2 with us?
Well, all right. I'll think and pray about it. But it's possible.
Okay. So I have some questions here. The first question I asked, I had written earlier in your your presentation, but if I can, you answered it later. I wanted to say, what does classical education consist of? But you went on to show us that it consists of everything, at least education. Modern education, you have just maths, English, and those basics. For classical education, you're looking at truths. You're appreciating goodness, the beauty of things. And then at the same time, even as you learn all the other subjects, you learn the maths, the English, and so on. Okay, so that is, you were able to answer that question.
Yes. So maybe I will do it in my part 2, but I mentioned also that the classical education has a different approach to this subject. So whereas in modern education, you just go and begin to learn maths, right? But classical education has a different approach, and the approach is called the trivium.
Okay.
I didn't want to go into all those technical. There's trivium. There's quadrivium.
It's not a problem. The only person that I know that, I'm so sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, you can continue, don't worry.
Yes, the only person that I know that is into classical education is our brother Olushola from Jos. Can you give us an idea of, you know, already you have told us that in the classroom, students are allowed to critical thinking. They're even allowed to engage their teachers. Sometimes there is a need for back and forth and all of that, probably arguments and all of that. So in a regular, you know, younger class, older, middle class, older class, how is the learning in practical sense? Have you been part? GB, are you hearing me?
Oh yeah, you ceased for a while.
Oh, okay. So I was just asking.
Yeah, but I think I get your question. Yeah, you wanted to know the practical experience of it, or the practical execution of classical education, how it looks like.
Yes.
Oh yeah. So first you learn what they call the 7 liberal arts, and the 7 liberal arts, you have grammar, logic, rhetoric. You have astronomy, music. So these courses or these subjects are subjects that do not even exist in the modern progressive method. So for instance, now in primary one, have you ever heard any student or any pupil learning grammar and logic or rhetoric? Right? But these subject matters are the essential matters and the tools that you use to learn every other subject. Yeah. So for instance, now, grammar, logic, rhetoric, you use that to learn, let me go practical, Nigerian history. So in the classroom, how it works is you learn the grammar of Nigerian history, you learn the logic of Nigerian history, and then you learn the rhetoric of Nigerian history. So how does that look like? The grammar of Nigerian history is about information, data, fact. So you're learning, let's say for instance now, let me use one fact about Nigerian history. So Nigeria got independence in 1960, right? So that's a fact. That's the grammar of Nigerian history. Okay, well, that's one of the facts, right? Then the logic of it is you begin to learn the reasons behind it, all the players behind that independence in 1960. Then the rhetoric of it is combining the facts that you just learned, the reasons and logic that you just learned about Nigerian history, and then putting it in your own language and expressing it in a way that is wise and eloquent. So classical the classical education approaches all these subjects from a different approach and in a way that is entirely different from progressive method.
Oh, okay, so you mentioned
Hello?
In their higher classes, do they learn those building blocks that could help them to be able to write and probably medicine, engineering? Sorry, GB, my internet failed. Did you get my question?
No, I didn't get your question.
Oh no. Okay, so I was asking that is there a university? I mean, you mentioned the need to probably back to university for the classical system. Do you already have that in place that will help the students for their further training? I mean, for their further work in life, or do you have a system in the primary and the secondary level of education that will help them to be able to fit into later life, probably when they need to go to apply as workers to be maybe a medical doctor, an engineer, or anything? Do you have that kind of system, or how are you working it around? Because obviously this is a new educational system in Nigeria.
Okay, you mean in Nigeria today?
Yes.
Well, in Nigeria today, we don't have the we don't have it pronounced or famous right now, but there's a nursery and primary school level. But at the secondary school level, there's Rafiki, working on that. So that's good. At the university level, no, it doesn't exist, because from the classical perspective, what do you go to do in education? What do you go to do in the university? University is the acquisition of skills, right? Yes. So in the classical perspective, your most important level or tier of education is the primary.
Oh.
Yes, it's not university. In Nigeria today, you ask anybody, what tier of education is most important? They say university. So in Nigeria today, if you don't go to university, you're not educated yet.
Yes.
If you stopped in secondary school or primary school, you're not educated yet. But yes. classically, the most important part of your education is the primary, then the secondary. That's where your education stops. So you go to university not to go learn the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and general studies, and GS that all these Nigerian universities learn in their first year, GS and philosophy and all those things. No, you go straight to go acquire a skill, right? And then you go earn a living with that skill on the backdrop of the education, the wisdom you've acquired in your primary and secondary school. So classically, an SS2 or SS3 graduate, a WAEC holder, is very, very educated. Very educated. He has wisdom, he has virtue, he has eloquence.
Okay, Gibi, I'm sorry to interrupt you. What I'm trying to ask really is that somebody who has classical education, primary or secondary school level, will that person be equipped enough to write something like JAM, WAEC, and so on? Would they
yes. Sure, yeah.
Okay, they learn physics, chemistry, probably also the arts and all of that together, even in their higher secondary school. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they do, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, GB. Let me take this question from Awolowo Mosope. He left a question as a comment here. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the brief expose by Brother GB. I have two questions. The first is, you mentioned the fact that classical education follows a normative tradition of inculcation as opposed to a dynamic or modern technique. I want to ask, is classical Christian education against innovation? That's his first question. The second one is the reason for limiting unhealthy competition amongst learners based on the individual peculiarities of the students, or because of the intrinsic rigidity of the classical curriculum for the individual students? Jimmy, did you get the question? It's in the comments.
Yeah, I'm trying to go read it.
Okay, Awolowo is also seem to be classically trained because
normative. What does it mean by not? I never use that word normative. I never use that word.
Okay, so classical education, you're more or less saying
follows a normative tradition.
I think what more you might have been discussing is even saying that classical education puts the student or the children or the child or the person in a position where he is even more innovative than what we have in the progressive education. Is that correct, Jimmy?
Oh yes. So, but if I get what he's trying to say, so the classical Christian or the classical education method, you want to achieve two things in terms of education. You want to achieve wisdom. You want to achieve what works the best. You want to achieve the best way to train a child in order to bring out the child's highest potentials. Mm-hmm. Again, those two methods, the classical method has proven to be more effective in achieving that goal.
Perhaps I should also add that you also want to inculcate in the child the idea of what truth is, because truth is not relative and truth is objective. Is constant. It is what God has said in His Word. So you want to have that imbibed in the child at the same time.
Exactly. So again, it depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to achieve a child that is well groomed in every way, knows God, his affections are awakened to the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? It's the classical method. But if you want to innovate on the method, right? If you can innovate on the method to achieve those ends, why not? But so far, all the innovations they brought, the innovation John Dewey brought into the education system did not, rather it reduced the quality of education, right? But classical Christian education or classical method is not opposed to technology. If that, looking at it from another perspective, you still incorporate technology into your learning process or method, but of course with wisdom and tact. You can't say you're teaching a 2 years old and you're teaching the 2 years old with iPad or a phone or whatsoever. No, you still go the way of written text, because the kids are supposed to be lovers of the word. Classically, we believe that students are supposed to be lovers of the written word, of the written text. And that is completely different from the modern progressive method that deals with virtuals. So a modern child right now cannot take a book and read it cover to cover in one sitting. Just a 50 pages book cannot read it cover to cover in one sitting. But they are good enough to sit in front of TV, and they could sit 2 days straight in front of TV and enjoying different kind of shows and entertainment.
Yeah.
So again, in terms of technological innovations, the classical method is not opposed to it. The classical method integrates technology, but with wisdom and tact, in a way that does not reduce the quality of education and also does not take away the relish for written text.
Okay, all right. Thank you, GB, for your presentation. If you're just joining us, our brother GB has just been speaking to us about classical education and how relevant it is to the Christian perspective. Okay, it's important. It's impossible for you to really get the meat of it except you start the whole video from the beginning. So I want to appeal to those who are just joining us that when this is published on our website or on our YouTube channel, please try to watch the whole stretch of it. Okay, that's number one. And then number two, GB, I want to plead with you that you try to look over your notes and again see how you can do a second presentation for us. Basically, what you will do is maybe just do a summary of all that you have said in the first part. And then in the second part, you just probably go more into some details. But what is very clear is that the classical education preserves truth. The classical education helps students to be better in critical thinking. It helps them to appreciate the beauty of God's creation. It helps them to appreciate God. And then it takes them away from all of these progressive tendencies and these liberal tendencies that our world is quickly moving into. I do not want the video broadcast to be too long so that those who eventually get to watch it won't sit for so long in watching it. Hopefully, we wouldn't have gone more than 1 hour. Thank you, GB. We really, really appreciate you. For those who joined us, we really appreciate you. By God's grace, we'll be having another presentation maybe in another week's time or 2 weeks' time on the Reformed Nigeria television. But it is clear to us that classical education is a lot better than the kind of education we're getting. And for those of us who have young children, we want to engage that. Thank you so very much. And at this moment, I'm going to bring the recording to an end.